We're going to take the whole chapter because this is really, I've entitled this message, Paul's Last Defense. This is the last defense Paul makes of his apostleship and against the charges that have been made against him by the Jews. It's the longest speech Paul makes in the book of Acts. It really begins with verse 1 and ends at the end of the chapter, so I wanted to get it all in one shot. So we're going to go there. The speech that he makes is broken down into several different components. It will begin with the first one, which is the opening and complimentary remarks. Now let's remember where Paul is at this point. He's still in Caesarea. He's being held by Festus, and Festus has had a visit from King Agrippa. And King Agrippa is a Jew, knows all about the Jewish customs and laws and everything, and he wants to hear what Paul has to say. So Paul is brought before King Agrippa and his wife Bernice and Festus, all the commanders of the army, all the leading nobles in the city. They're all there to hear Paul make his defense. So we have in verses 1 to 3 his opening, Paul's opening and his complimentary remarks. Then Agrippa said to Paul, "You are permitted to speak for yourself." So Paul stretched out his hand and answered for himself. I don't know what this gesture was. Maybe it was this, maybe it was this. I don't have any idea. But it was apparently some kind of a rhetorical gesture to let yourself warm up to your subject. Now, Agrippa takes the lead here, even though he's an invite. He's been invited by Festus. He probably outranks Festus being king and Festus being a governor and Agrippa being the king. But he says here, Paul stretches out his hand and answers for himself, "I think myself happy, King Agrippa, because today I shall answer for myself before you concerning all the things of which I am accused by the Jews." So he's happy to have this opportunity to make his defense. Let me turn this on, it might work better. There we go. So, this kind of dovetails with what Peter says in 1 Peter 3:14 and 15. He says, "But even if you should suffer for righteousness' sake, you are blessed. And do not be afraid of their threats, nor be troubled. But sanctify the Lord in your hearts, and always be ready to make a defense to everyone who asks you for the reason that for the hope that is within you, with meekness and fear." And so this is exactly where Paul is. He has an opportunity to make a defense for the hope that is within him. So he's here not only to defend himself against the charges, but you're going to see he sees this as an opportunity to share the gospel. And this should be an automatic prompt for you anytime that you have an opportunity to share Christ, that this is how you should react. So we come to verse 3, especially because you are an expert in all the customs and questions which have to do with the Jews. Therefore, I beg to hear you patiently. So Paul is really ahead of the game with Agrippa because he doesn't have to bring him up to speed on why the Jews think the way they do and why they act the way they do. Agrippa is a Jew. He knows how they think. Okay, Festus, he had to start way back before that and bring Festus all the way up to speed. He's really ahead of the game with Agrippa because Agrippa knows these things. Agrippa has the background to understand what Paul's about to say to him here. So he goes from his opening here to his description of his early life in verses 4 to 8. He says in verse 4, "My manner of life from my youth, which was spent from the beginning among my own nation at Jerusalem, all the Jews know." All these people who have accused me, they know me. They watched me grow up. Okay? And this is important because how is he suddenly going to change from what he was brought up as and all of the characteristics that he had, all of his qualities, all of his virtues? They know this. They know this. They know him since he was a kid. They know me from the first, if they are willing to testify that according to the strictest sect of our religion, I lived as a Pharisee. Okay? Now, Paul mentions this in Philippians 3:5 rather, that he was circumcised the 8th day, of the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, concerning the law, a Pharisee. So this is Paul's background. They know all of this. Verse 6, "And now I stand and am judged for the hope of the promise made to God our fathers." All the Jews knew the promises. All the Jews knew that God was going to send a Messiah to them. So they're all on the same page here. They all understand the promises. They all agree. They're all hoping for the same thing. They're all hoping for the same Messiah. So we come down to verse 7. This promise are 12 tribes earnestly serving God, night and day, hope to attain. For this sake, King Agrippa, I am accused by the Jews. Now, this accused by the Jews in the Greek is very emphatic. It's like he's saying, how could they be accusing me of having the same hope that they have? Notice how it makes King Agrippa no sense at all. Okay, this is the emphasis. Then he says in verse 8, why should it be thought incredible by you that God raises the dead? Now the you here is plural. So you can almost see Paul looking around at all of his audience and saying, how can all of you think it incredible that God should raise the dead? Matthew 22:32, Jesus said, I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Or have I not said, I am the God of Abraham, God of Isaac, God of Jacob? God is not the God of the dead, but of the living. In other words, if the Jewish nation is looking forward to the fulfillment of promises, they have to believe in the resurrection, because they all died without seeing the promises. So how are they going to see the promises of God fulfilled? There has to be a resurrection. They have to be brought back to life in order, when Christ comes again, to enjoy those promises fulfilled. Okay? So this is his early life in Judaism. Now he goes into verses 9 to 11, his zeal in opposing Christianity. In verse 9 we read this, I myself thought I must do many things contrary to the name of Jesus of Nazareth. So Paul was on the side of all the others, of all the Pharisees, all the Sadducees, the Sanhedrin, all of the teachers, all of the lawyers. He was on their side against Jesus. John 16:2 says, they will put you out of the synagogues. Yes, the time is coming when whoever kills you will think that he offers God service. So Christ had predicted this. And this is exactly where Paul is. He says, this is what I used to be like. And this is how things are going today. Verse 10, this I also did in Jerusalem, and many of the saints I shut up in prison, having received authority from the chief priests, and when they were put to death, I cast my vote against them. This is how far I've gone. This is how far that I had sold out the promises and the hope of our nations. Galatians 1:13, Paul wrote to the Galatian church, he says, for you have heard of my former conduct in Judaism, how I persecuted the church of God beyond measure and tried to destroy it. So when Paul is describing his zeal in trying to stamp out Christianity, he's pulling out all the stops. He says, this is how bad I used to be. Verse 11, he says, when I punished them often in every synagogue and compelled them to blaspheme, and being exceedingly enraged against them, I persecuted them even to foreign cities. You couldn't get worse than Paul. You couldn't find a more zealous persecutor of the church than Paul. Paul was in a state of spiritual blindness, as the Jews are to this day. And as I thought about that, I thought about, what brings on this kind of spiritual blindness? How can we understand it? Well, first of all, spiritual blindness, let me explain it to you. Paul writes to the Corinthian church, he says, but the natural man does not receive the things of the Spirit of God, for they are foolishness to him, nor can he know them, because they are spiritually discerned. So there you go. You're either saved or you're unsaved. You're either a natural man or a spiritual man. And the natural man is not going to get this. He's just not going to understand the things of God. He's not going to understand the gospel message unless God has called him and prepared him for that. Let's look at the origin of spiritual blindness. Again, the Corinthian church, 2 Corinthians 4:4, whose minds the God of this age has blinded, who do not believe, lest the light of the gospel of the glory of Christ, who is the image of God, should shine in them. This, of course, is Satan. Satan is the one who does the blinding. He's the one who produces these men who are spiritually blind and can't get it. But we also need to know, how do we get this thing removed? Jesus does it. Isaiah 42:7, describing the role of Christ to open the blind eyes, to bring out prisoners from the prison, those who sit in darkness from the prison house. So this is how we get rid of spiritual blindness. Christ comes and takes it away. Okay, so here we go. We've looked at his zeal in opposing Christianity. He moves on from that to a report of his conversion and his commission. Verse 12, while thus occupied, I journeyed to Damascus with authority and commission from the chief priest. Now, he has authority, but he also has something else. He has a commission. This is huge. You really need to understand this, because he didn't just say, you know what, I'd like to go beat up some Christians in Damascus. Would that be okay? Yeah, that's okay. Go ahead and do that. No, they commissioned him. That means he was given orders to do that. So he has the full authority. He has the full backing of the chief priest to go and do this. In verse 13, he says, at midday, O king, along the road, I saw a light from heaven, brighter than the sun, shining around me and those who journeyed with me. You remember this. You remember this from back to Acts chapter 9. This is a repeat of the same situation. Verse 14 says, and when we had all fallen to the ground, I heard a voice speaking to me and saying in the Hebrew language, Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me? It is hard for you to kick against the goads. How many of you know what a goad is? Ellen knows what a goad is. Some of you might. A goad was a sharp metal prong or rod that you would use with an oxen when you were plowing, okay? And if the oxen stopped and you couldn't get him going, you stick him in the rump with this goad. Now what happens if he kicks against the goad? It's going to hurt even more. So this is what Jesus is saying here. It hurts you to kick against the goads. Now, what could Christ have said at this point other than that? He could have said, Paul, your time is up. Your reign of terror has now come to an end. I'm going to zap you just like that. But he didn't do that. He didn't do that. Because Christ is a God of mercy. Christ is a God of mercy. And in thinking about that, what do we need to know about the mercy of God? Number one, God's mercy is abundant. 1 Peter 1:3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who according to his abundant mercy has begotten us again to a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus Christ from the dead. So anytime you need God's mercy, when you sin, it's not the end of the story, because God has mercy. Okay? He will forgive you because he is a God of mercy. His mercy is also high as the heaven. Psalm 103 verse 11, for as high as the heavens are above the earth, so great is his mercy towards those who fear him. How high is the heaven above the earth? It just keeps on going. It just keeps on going. And we need to understand that, because we have things that confine us here on the earth. We have a room here with walls. We have a ceiling. If I started floating up toward the ceiling, I would stop when I hit the ceiling. But if I was to go through the ceiling and keep on going, there's no end. There's no end. It used to blow my mind as a little kid to lay on the grass on my back and look up at the heavens and realize there's no end to that. You know? But that's the way it is. That's how high God's mercy is. It's higher than the heavens above the earth. It's also everlasting. It never runs out. Psalm 107 verse 1, oh, give thanks to the Lord, for he is good, for his mercy endures forever. You're never going to come to God for mercy and have him say, I'm sorry, I just ran out. I just gave the last bit of mercy to the person who came before you. It's never going to run out. So we get back to verse 15. Paul says, so I said, who are you, Lord? And he said, I am Jesus whom you are persecuting. And like I've always pointed out to you in the past, when you are persecuted as a believer, they're not persecuting just you, they're persecuting Christ. And he takes that very personally. He says, I am Jesus who you are persecuting. Verse 16, but rise and stand on your feet, for I have appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and a witness, both of the things which you have seen and of the things which I will yet reveal to you. Again, the mercy of Christ. He tells him everything that he needs to know about why he's been blinded and thrown, and that's not brought out here, but as we know from Acts chapter 9. He's blinded for 3 days, he can't see anything, until they take him into Damascus, and Ananias comes and prays over him, and the scales fall off his eyes. That's all part of this picture here that Luke is not bringing out at this particular point. But it's all part of the mercy of Christ. He tells him everything that he's done and why he stopped him and gave him a commission rather than a death sentence. He says, I've appeared to you for this purpose, to make you a minister and witness both of the things which you have seen and the things which I will yet reveal to you. In other words, I'm taking you now to be my child, and I will reveal to you everything that you need to know. And he says in verse 17, I will deliver you from the Jewish people as well as from the Gentiles to whom I now send you. Remember, this is a big problem for Paul, being sent to the Gentiles. Remember when they grabbed him in the temple and drug him out into the court of the Gentiles, and they were whooping up on him, and they got stopped by the centurion Lysias and pulled him up the steps where he was safe, and he wanted a chance to speak to them, and he started speaking to the mob, and they went quiet. And when he started speaking in Hebrew, they got even more quiet. You could hear a pin drop. And he was doing pretty good. He was telling them basically the same thing that Paul is saying here to Agrippa, until he got to the point that Jesus said, I'm sending you to the Gentiles. That's when the wheels fell off. That's when all the problems came. But you know, in Isaiah 49, in Isaiah 49:6, it is too small a thing that you should be my servant to raise up the tribes of Jacob and to restore the preserved ones of Israel. I will also give you as a light to the Gentiles,